I paid off my husband's entire family debt, and that same night, he told me he was in love with someone else. And the way he said it was what stayed with me. Not rushed, not ashamed, just calm, like he was finally setting himself free. I stood there at the dining table, the receipt still folded in my purse, the confirmation email still fresh on my phone, $150,000 transferred that morning. Years of savings gone in a single decision I thought would strengthen our future, and he looked at me as if I had simply done what I was supposed to do. I am glad you are here. Stay with me until the end, and tell me where you are watching from. Because what happened after that moment changed everything I believed about trust, about marriage, about what it means to give without question. The room was still decorated from dinner, candles flickering softly, plates half cleared. A quiet reflection of what I thought had been a celebration. I had planned everything carefully, his favorite meal, his favorite wine, even a small toast to acknowledge that we had finally closed a chapter that had weighed on his family for years. I remember the way he smiled earlier that evening, the way he thanked me in front of everyone, calling me generous, calling me supportive, and for a brief moment, I believed it meant something. But now, standing across from him in the same room, that version of the night felt distant, almost unreal. I did not want to keep lying to you. He continued, his tone steady, as if honesty itself was enough to justify everything that came with it. I looked at him, really looked at him, and realized something I had been avoiding for a long time. This was not sudden. This was not a mistake. This was something that had been happening quietly, just like everything else in our marriage that I had chosen not to question. I did not ask who she was. I did not ask how long it had been going on, not because I did not want to know, but because I already understood enough. I understood the distance, the late nights, the way conversations had become shorter, more functional, less real. I understood the way my effort had slowly become expected rather than appreciated, and as that realization settled in, something inside me shifted, not breaking, not collapsing, but aligning, like a truth finally stepping into place where doubt used to live. I placed my hands lightly on the back of the chair in front of me, grounding myself in something steady, something real, and I nodded once, a small, simple movement that seemed to surprise him more than anything I could have said, because I did not react the way he expected. I did not raise my voice. I did not ask him to explain. I did not even ask him to stay. I simply accepted what he had revealed, not as something new, but as confirmation of something I had already begun to understand. He hesitated then, just for a second, as if waiting for a response that would pull the moment into something more familiar, something emotional, something he could manage. But when it did not come, when I remained still, composed, present, I saw it in his expression, the first small crack in the certainty he had walked into the room with. And that was when I realized, this moment was not the end of something. It was the beginning of something else entirely, something he had not prepared for, something he did not see coming. And as the silence settled between us, not heavy, not uncomfortable, just clear, I understood that everything from this point forward would be defined not by what he had done, but by what I chose to do next. I did not ask him to leave that night, and that seemed to confuse him more than anything else. He stood there for a moment, waiting, as if expecting me to react in a way that would make the situation familiar again. Something emotional, something loud, something he could respond to, but I gave him nothing. I walked past him quietly, picking up the empty plates from the table, stacking them carefully in the sink. The same routine I had followed for years. Only this time it felt different, not automatic, not expected, just chosen. He watched me. I could feel it without turning around. The weight of his confusion filling the space where my reaction should have been. "Are you going to say anything?" he asked finally, his voice uncertain in a way I had never heard before. I rinsed a glass slowly, placing it aside before answering. "I think you already said enough." My tone calm, even, not sharp, not emotional, just clear. The silence that followed stretched longer than before, and I could sense him trying to understand what this meant, whether it was acceptance, indifference, or something else entirely. But I knew he would not find the answer in that moment, because I had not fully formed it yet myself. I only knew that something had shifted, something that would not return to what it was before. Later that night, I sat alone in the living room, the house quiet in a way that felt almost unfamiliar. I looked around at everything we had built together, the furniture, the photos, the small details that once felt like proof of a shared life. And for the first time, I saw them without attachment, not because they no longer mattered, but because I understood that they were never the foundation I believed them to be. They were just pieces, arranged around something that had already started to break long before this night. I leaned back in my chair and let the silence settle, not resisting it, not trying to fill it, just allowing it to exist. Because within that quiet, I could finally hear something I had ignored for years: the pattern, the imbalance, the way everything had always leaned in one direction, my effort, my support, my resources flowing outward, while his remained protected, controlled, untouched. I thought about the money, the transfer I had made that morning, the relief I had felt, believing I was helping us move forward, and I realized how easily I had stepped into that role without question, how natural it had felt to give without asking what I was receiving in return. I did not feel regret, not in the way I expected. I felt clarity, because regret would have kept me tied to the past, and what I needed now was to see it for what it was, not what I hoped it could be. I stood up and walked to my desk, opening my laptop, the screen lighting up the room with a soft glow. I logged into the accounts I had not reviewed closely in months, scrolling through transactions, balances, records that told a story far more precise than memory ever could. And as I moved through each line, each number, something became clear: the structure of everything, the way it had been arranged, the way it could be changed. I did not rush. I did not react. I simply observed, understanding that what I did next would not come from emotion. It would come from knowledge, from control, from the quiet realization that I had more influence over this situation than I had ever allowed myself to see. And as I sat there in the dim light, the house still, the world outside moving forward without pause, I knew that whatever came next would not be shaped by what he had done, but by what I was now ready to do with the truth I could no longer ignore. I did not sleep much that night, but it was not because I was overwhelmed. It was because my mind had finally stopped avoiding what it already knew. I sat at my desk long after the house had gone quiet, the soft glow of the screen reflecting across the room. And for the first time, I was not looking at our finances as something shared. I was looking at them as something structured, something defined by names, accounts, access, and control. I opened each account carefully, not rushing, not reacting, just reading, tracing the movement of money over time. The patterns that had once felt normal now revealing something else entirely, something deliberate. I saw how often I had stepped in to cover gaps, how naturally I had transferred funds without question, how easily I had accepted explanations that never required proof. And as I followed each transaction, each detail, something settled deeper within me, not anger, not regret, just understanding. Because this was not a sudden betrayal. It was a system that had existed quietly, built over time, supported by my willingness to trust without verifying. I leaned back in my chair and closed my eyes for a moment, letting that realization fully take shape, not as something painful, but as something clear. When I opened my eyes again, I reached for my phone, scrolling through contacts until I found a name I had not needed in years, someone who had once helped me review contracts early in our marriage, someone who had asked careful questions when I had not known to ask them myself. I paused briefly, not out of hesitation, but because I understood what making this call meant. It meant I was no longer observing. I was acting. I pressed the number and held the phone to my ear, the sound of it ringing steady and quiet. And when the call connected, I introduced myself calmly, explaining that I needed a professional review of financial structures tied to my name, that I wanted clarity, not assumptions. There was a pause on the other end, followed by a tone of recognition, then agreement. A meeting set for the next morning. I thanked him and ended the call, placing the phone back down. With the same controlled movement I had used all evening. Nothing about this felt rushed, nothing felt uncertain. It felt precise, intentional. I turned back to the screen, reviewing one last set of documents. Not because I needed to confirm anything, but because I wanted to fully understand the position I was in before anyone else explained it to me. I traced my name where it appeared, the accounts linked to it, the authority that had been there all along without being acknowledged, and I realized that the balance of everything I had believed was already shifting, not because something new had been created, but because something that had always existed was finally being seen clearly. I closed the laptop slowly and rested my hands on the desk, the room silent around me. And for the first time, I did not feel like I was reacting to what had happened earlier that night. I felt like I was stepping into something that had been waiting for me to recognize it. And as I stood up and walked toward the window, the early hint of morning just beginning to appear in the distance, I understood that whatever came next would not be shaped by emotion or confrontation. It would be shaped by knowledge, by timing, and by the quiet decision to stop giving away what had always been mine. To hold the next morning arrived with a quiet clarity that felt unfamiliar but steady. I moved through the house slowly, not out of hesitation, but because I was aware of every detail in a way I had not been before. The light coming through the windows, the sound of the coffee machine, the subtle presence of a life that had once felt shared but now felt separate. He was already awake when I entered the kitchen, standing by the counter, his posture slightly tense, as if he had been waiting for something, perhaps a reaction that never came. "Did you sleep?" he asked, his tone careful, almost measured, and I poured my coffee before answering. "Enough," I said simply, my voice calm. Unchanged, he watched me for a moment longer, searching for something that was no longer visible, something that used to be easy for him to read. But I gave him nothing to interpret. I sat down at the table and took a slow sip, allowing the silence to settle naturally between us, not forcing conversation, not avoiding it, just letting it exist. "We should talk about last night," he said finally, and I nodded once, not inviting the conversation, but not rejecting it either. "We can," I replied, setting the cup down carefully, my movements controlled. He sat across from me, leaning slightly forward, as if proximity might restore something that had already shifted. I did not plan for it to happen like that. He began, choosing his words with care, but I noticed something beneath them, not regret, but discomfort, the kind that comes from consequences rather than actions. I listened without interrupting, my gaze steady, my expression neutral, because this moment was no longer about understanding him. It was about observing him clearly. "It has been complicated," he continued. "I did not want to hurt you." And for a brief second, I almost responded the way I used to, offering reassurance, minimizing the situation to keep things stable. But that instinct passed just as quickly as it appeared, replaced by something quieter, something more grounded. "You did not consider me at all," I said calmly, not as an accusation, not as an emotional reaction, just as a statement of fact. He paused, the words settling between us in a way that could not be redirected, and for the first time, he did not immediately respond. "That is not fair," he said after a moment. But the confidence in his voice was thinner now, less certain. I leaned back, slightly, resting my hands in my lap, my posture relaxed, because I did not need to convince him of anything. "Fair is not what this is about," I replied, and I could see it then, the small shift in his expression, the recognition that this conversation was not following the pattern he expected, that I was no longer reacting within the space he understood. He looked at me for a moment longer, as if trying to find the version of me he had always relied on, but it was not there, and I did not offer it back to him. The silence returned, but this time it felt different, not uncertain, not waiting, just complete. I stood up after a moment, carrying my cup to the sink, rinsing it slowly, placing it aside with the same care I had used for everything else. "I have a meeting this morning," I said, not explaining further, not asking for permission, just stating what was already decided. He frowned slightly, caught off guard. "A meeting," he repeated, and I nodded once, drying my hands before turning back toward him. "Yes," I said, and that was all. I did not elaborate. I did not clarify, because this was not a conversation that required his understanding. It was a step that required my action. I picked up my bag from the chair and moved toward the door, aware of his gaze following me, but not affected by it. And as I stepped outside into the morning air, the quiet sense of direction settled more firmly within me, because I understood now that nothing about what came next would be shaped by what he said in that kitchen. It would be shaped by what I was already prepared to do. I arrived at the office 10 minutes early, not because I was nervous, but because I wanted to observe everything without distraction. The building was quiet, understated, the kind of place where decisions are made without noise. I stepped inside and gave my name to the receptionist, her tone polite, neutral. As she directed me to a seat near the window, I placed my bag beside me, and sat with my hands resting lightly on my lap, my posture relaxed, my mind clear. This was not a confrontation. This was a confirmation. When he came out to meet me, his expression was exactly as I remembered, composed, attentive, someone who listened before speaking. And that alone told me I had come to the right place. We walked into his office together, the space neat, organized, everything placed with intention. I took the seat across from his desk and set my folder down in front of me, opening it slowly, sliding the documents toward him without explanation. He did not rush. He did not react. He simply began to read, his eyes moving steadily across each page, occasionally pausing, occasionally returning to a detail, and I watched the process unfold, not searching for reassurance, but recognizing the difference between assumption and analysis. After a few minutes, he leaned back slightly, his hands coming together as he looked at me with a level of focus that felt precise. "How long have these accounts been structured this way?" he asked, his tone calm, direct. I answered without hesitation, "Several years." He nodded once, as if confirming something he had already begun to understand. And then he began to explain, not dramatically, not emotionally, but clearly, outlining the ownership tied to my name, the authority that had never actually been transferred away, the access that had been assumed rather than legally secured. Each word settling into place with quiet certainty, not surprising, not overwhelming, just aligning with what I had already started to see. "Based on this," he continued, tapping lightly on one of the pages, "you have significantly more control than you have been exercising." I held his gaze, my expression unchanged, because that statement did not feel like a revelation. It felt like recognition. "If I were to act on that," I asked, my voice steady, "what would that look like?" He paused briefly, choosing his words with care. "It would not be subtle," he replied, and there was no warning in his tone, only clarity. I nodded once, accepting that without hesitation, because subtlety was no longer the point. Understanding was. He outlined the next steps in measured detail, the process of securing accounts, the legal adjustments that would formalize what already existed, the way everything would shift once it was put into motion. I listened without interruption, not because I was overwhelmed, but because I was already aligned with the direction he was describing. When he finished, the room fell into a brief, natural silence, not uncertain, not waiting, just complete. I closed the folder slowly, my hand resting on top of it for a moment, and then I looked back at him. "Then we proceed," I said, not as a question, not as a request, but as a decision. He gave a small nod, acknowledging the weight of that choice without adding anything unnecessary. And as I stood up to leave, the clarity that had begun the night before settled fully into place, because this was no longer about reacting to what had been done to me. It was about acting on what had always been within my reach. And as I stepped back out into the daylight, the city moving around me as if nothing had changed, I understood that everything already had when I returned home that afternoon. Nothing in the house had changed, but everything felt different in a way that could not be reversed. The same furniture, the same quiet, the same rhythm of a life that had once felt shared, now revealing itself as something divided. He was sitting in the living room when I walked in, his posture slightly rigid, as if he had been waiting without admitting that he was. His eyes followed me as I set my bag down, moving through the space with the same calm, deliberate pace I had carried all day. "Where did you go?" he asked, his tone controlled. But there was something beneath it now, something less certain than before. I took off my coat and placed it neatly on the chair before answering. "I had something to take care of," I said, my voice even, not defensive, not distant, just clear. He stood up then, taking a step closer, as if proximity might give him access to something he could no longer read. "What kind of something?" he pressed, and I turned to face him, meeting his gaze without hesitation. "The kind that should have been taken care of a long time ago," I replied, and for a brief moment, he did not respond, his expression shifting slightly as if trying to place my words into a context he understood, but finding nothing familiar. "Is this about last night?" he asked, and I noticed how carefully he chose his tone, as if the right balance of concern and control might still bring the conversation back within his reach. I walked past him into the kitchen, pouring a glass of water, taking a slow sip before answering. "This is about everything," I said calmly, setting the glass down with a soft, deliberate Motion, the silence that followed stretched between us, not tense, not uncertain, just present. He leaned against the counter, watching me more closely now, studying my movements in a way he had not done in years, as if he were seeing me for the first time without the assumptions he had always relied on. "You are acting differently," he said finally, and I allowed a small pause before responding, not because I needed time, but because I wanted the moment to remain exactly as it was. "I am not acting," I said quietly. "I am paying attention." The words settled into the space between us with a clarity that did not require emphasis, and I could see it then, the realization beginning to form, not fully understood, but enough to disrupt the certainty he had carried for so long. He straightened slightly, as if preparing to regain control of the conversation. "We can figure this out," he said, and I almost smiled, not out of humor, but out of recognition, because that was always the pattern, the attempt to move forward without addressing what had already been broken. I picked up my bag again, holding it lightly at my side. "I already am," I replied, and this time, when the silence followed, it did not feel like something waiting to be filled. It felt complete. I walked toward the hallway without looking back, aware of his gaze but no longer affected by it. And as I reached the door to my office, I paused for just a second, not to reconsider, but to recognize the shift that had already taken place, because this was no longer a conversation about what had happened. It was the beginning of what would happen next, and he was no longer the one defining it. The following morning did not bring any visible change, but I could feel the shift settling deeper into everything around me. Like a quiet current moving beneath the surface, I woke up before him as I always did, moving through the house with the same familiar routine. But this time every action felt intentional, chosen rather than automatic. I made coffee and sat by the window, the early light stretching across the table, my phone resting beside me, and for a moment, I simply observed the stillness, not waiting, not anticipating, just present, because I understood that what had been set in motion would now begin to reveal itself. My phone vibrated softly, a message from the attorney confirming that the first set of changes had been processed, accounts updated, access restructured, everything aligned with the authority that had always been tied to my name. I read the message once, then again, not out of disbelief, but to fully register what it meant, and then I set the phone down, my expression unchanged, my breathing steady, because this was not a moment that required reaction. It required awareness. He entered the kitchen shortly after, his presence quieter than usual, as if he were adjusting to something he could not yet define. "Morning," he said, his tone careful, and I nodded once, lifting my cup slightly before taking a sip, the silence between us no longer uncomfortable, just different. He poured his coffee and stood across from me, watching, waiting. "I tried to log into the account this morning," he said after a moment, and there it was, the first sign, subtle, controlled, but unmistakable. I placed my cup down gently before responding. "That would make sense," I said, my voice calm. "Even," he frowned slightly, not fully understanding yet, but sensing the shift. "It is not working," he added, his tone sharpening just enough to reveal the tension beneath it. I met his gaze without hesitation. "It is working exactly the way it should," I replied, and the words settled into the space between us with quiet precision. He stared at me then, really looked, as if trying to reconcile the person sitting in front of him with the version he had always known. "What did you do?" he asked, and this time there was no control in his voice, only the beginning of something else, something less certain. I rested my hands lightly on the table, my posture relaxed, my expression steady. "I reviewed what belonged to me," I said simply, and nothing more. The silence that followed was different now, heavier, filled with a realization that had not yet fully formed, but was impossible to ignore. He stepped closer, his movements less measured, less controlled. "You cannot just change things without telling me," he said, and I almost paused at that, not because I was unsure, but because I recognized the assumption behind it, the belief that explanation was something he was owed. I stood up slowly, taking my cup to the sink, rinsing it under running water, the sound steady, grounding, before turning back to him. "I did not change anything," I said calmly. I acknowledged it, and for the first time, he had no immediate response. No correction, no redirection, just silence. And in that silence, The shift became real, not just for me, but for him as well. I dried my hands and reached for my bag, holding it lightly at my side. This is not something you can fix with a conversation, I added, not harsh, not final, just true. And as I moved past him toward the door, I understood that the moment he had not expected was already here, not loud, not dramatic, but undeniable, because the control he thought he had never existed. In the way he believed, and now that he was beginning to see it, there was nothing left for him to hold on to. He did not try to stop me when I walked out that morning, but I could feel it behind me. The shift in everything he thought he understood, the quiet collapse of certainty that had always defined him. The day moved forward with a steady rhythm, but beneath it, everything continued to unfold exactly as it was meant to. By the time I returned home that evening, the house no longer felt like a shared space. It felt like a place in transition. He was in his office, the door slightly open, papers spread across his desk, his posture rigid, as if he had been trying to piece something together that no longer fit. He looked up when he heard me, his expression sharper now, more direct. "We need to talk," he said, and this time there was no attempt to soften it, no careful tone, just urgency. I stepped inside the doorway, not fully entering, not creating distance either, just standing. "Where I was, you can?" I replied calmly, giving him the space to say what he needed to say without stepping into it myself. He pushed a set of documents toward me across the desk, statements, printouts, records he had clearly spent the day reviewing. "These accounts, these transfers, this is not how things have ever worked," he said, his voice tight with frustration. But underneath it, something else, something closer to disbelief. I glanced at the papers briefly, recognizing them immediately, but not picking them up, not engaging with them physically, because I did not need to. "It is how they have always worked," I said, my tone even, and he shook his head slightly, as if rejecting the idea outright. "No. This is new. You changed something," he insisted, and I held his gaze, steady, grounded. I stopped ignoring something. I corrected quietly, and the distinction settled between us with a weight that could not be dismissed. He stood up then, moving around the desk, closer now, his movements less controlled than before. "You are doing this because of what I told you," he said, trying to bring it back to something he could explain. Something that fit within a cause and effect he understood. I did not respond immediately, not because I needed time, but because I understood that answering too quickly would keep the conversation within his structure, and that was no longer where I existed. "What you told me made things clear," I said finally, but this was already there. His expression shifted again, the certainty breaking further, replaced by something unsettled, something searching. "So what is this then?" he asked, and for the first time, the question was real, not rhetorical, not controlled. I stepped fully into the room then, not to confront him, but to stand in a space that had once belonged to his authority alone. "This is me understanding what belongs to me," I said, and my voice did not rise. It did not need to, because the truth carried itself without force. The silence that followed was heavier now, not because it was tense, but because it was undeniable. He looked at me as if trying to find a way to respond, a way to reposition himself within something that had already moved beyond him, but nothing came. And in that absence, the shift became complete. I turned slightly, my hand brushing lightly against the back of the chair as I moved toward the door. "This is not something you can undo," I added, not as a warning, not as a threat, just as a fact. And as I left the room, I understood that what he had not expected was never a reaction. It was the quiet certainty that followed, the kind that does not need to be explained, because it is already fully in place. The house was quiet that night, but it was no longer the kind of silence that felt uncertain. It was steady, settled, like something that had finally reached its natural conclusion. I stood in the living room for a moment, looking at the space around me, not searching for memories, not holding on to anything, just recognizing it for what it had been, a place where I had given more than I realized for longer than I should have. He remained in his office, the door now fully closed, and I did not feel the need to open it, because whatever was left to say no longer required words. I moved through the house slowly, not out of hesitation, but with intention, picking up only what belonged to me, not just physically, but in a way that felt aligned with everything that had shifted over the past days: a folder, my laptop, a few personal items, Nothing excessive, nothing dramatic, just what was necessary. I paused briefly at the doorway before stepping outside. The air cool, the evening quiet, and for the first time, I felt the absence of something I had once carried without question, the weight of needing to explain, to justify, to be understood. It was gone. And in its place was something simpler, something clearer. I walked to my car and placed my bag in the passenger seat, taking a moment before getting in, not because I was unsure, but because I understood that this moment did not need to be rushed. I sat behind the wheel and looked forward. The road ahead familiar, but now entirely my own. My phone buzzed softly beside me, his name appearing on the screen, and I glanced at it for just a second, not with hesitation, not with curiosity, just acknowledgement. The same name that had once held authority, expectation, and influence. Now simply a contact, nothing more. I let it ring, watching as the screen eventually went still again. And then I placed the phone face down without answering, because there was nothing left to say, no conversation that would change what had already been understood. I started the car and pulled away slowly, the house growing smaller behind me, not as something I was leaving in anger, but as something that no longer belonged to who I had become. The city lights reflected softly across the windshield as I drove, steady, controlled, without urgency, and I realized that what I had thought was a loss was never really that. It had been an exchange, $150,000 for something far more valuable, clarity, ownership, control. I did not lose anything. I revealed everything. And as I continued forward, the quiet certainty that had guided every step settled fully into place. Because this was never about what he confessed, it was about what I finally understood, and that was something no one could take away.